was actually awarded a silver level achievement in transportation planning award by the National American Planning Association that was accepted at the April conference in San Francisco a year and a half ago. So that was very exciting to see St. Louis recognized for some good planning. And actually some projects have already been completed as an outgrowth of that work, including some better walk signal timing in downtown. And then also the city of St. Louis recently applied for a transportation alternative planning grant to put a cycle track in on Tucker. So we'll see, hopefully that happens. We also worked on the Wentzville Historic Downtown Revitalization Plan. We do a lot of traffic calming plans. And then also we did the first Calm Streets plan for the Louisiana Calm Streets, which is a bike boulevard in South St. Louis City. So that's kind of an overview of the types of planning projects we work on, as well as our staff, and a little bit about who we are. Don't want to take too much more of your time, so I'll just finish on this note. Again, that's me, Jackie Knight. I'm a multimodal planner. There's my contact information. And, you know, I like to show this picture at the end of my presentations because it just demonstrates that it's never too early to start thinking about planning, you know, trying to ingrain some good street design standards in the mind of my young son. So thanks again to APA for having us. We are very proud to sponsor the APA section, and you know, we love these lunches where we can learn and network with our colleagues. And that's it.
Well, thank you very much, Jackie, for that presentation on CBB and the importance of traffic and how planners role and impacting how we move, not only in vehicles, but also people and also the young ones as your son. And, you know, it's really important to plan for all people. So next up, we have the man of the hour, Colin Gordon. Colin Gordon is the author of, again, Citizen Brown, and please email me if you would like to receive a signed copy. We're very fortunate to have signed copies from Colin Gordon with his book, Citizen Brown and Race, Democracy, and Equality in the St. Louis Suburbs. Colin is a professor at the University of Iowa at and he teaches with American public policy, American policy economy, and American urban history. He's also an author of Growing Apart, Mapping Decline, which is another book, St. Louis focused, also Dead on Arrival and New Deals. He's also a senior researcher with the Iowa Policy Project, and he's a recipient of the F. Wendell Miller Professorship in 2016, along with the University of Iowa Regents Award for Faculty Excellence. And with that, I will give it over to Colin Gordon. I stop sharing my screen. And Colin, I believe the controls are all you.
Okay. So can you see my opening slide okay?
Yes, sir.
And audio's okay?
Yes, sir.
Okay, good. Well, it's a pleasure to be here, or to sort of be here, to be here virtually anyway. It's the best we can do these days. I want to talk a little bit, mostly about my current book, but in order to put the account of Citizen Brown in context, I'm going to draw a little bit on my earlier book, Mapping Decline. Citizen Brown is really an effort to tell the historical backstory to the confrontation between Darren Wilson and Michael Brown in August of 2014. And it's sort of an extended essay on the opportunities and limits, historically speaking, of citizenship for African Americans in St. Louis County across the last century. And the story unfolds in this way. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about patterns of race and housing in Greater St. Louis, the sort of larger metropolitan pattern, and then focus in on these what I think are the important elements of the story when we reshift our focus to the county, the fragmentation of citizenship and the drawing of local boundaries, in the provision of local services, in patterns of urban renewal and redevelopment, and ultimately, in the case of Michael Brown, in the patterns of predatory policing that result. So let's start with a little bit of background on St. Louis. So St. Louis was one of a number of cities early in the 20th century, before conventional municipal zoning was even sanctioned by the courts, to attempt to limit racial occupancy with a formal racial zoning ordinance, prohibiting African-American occupancy to these blocks. The St. Louis ordinance, along with a number of others, including the lead ordinance in St. Louis, were thrown out by the Supreme Court on equal protection grounds in 1917. St. Louis realtors responded by adopting what they called an excluded zone in the city, restricting African-American occupancy, that is sales or rentals, to the blue shading you see here. Anyone selling or renting to an African-American outside the zone would lose their real estate license. And that in turn was buttressed by a widespread use of race restrictive deed covenants, which really had two patterns in the city of St. Louis. On the south side, what you see are large subdivision-based covenants on developments like St. Louis Hills. These are 300, 400, even 1,000 properties at once, with a single restriction covering all new construction. On the north side, surrounding the Ville and north of the Del Mar Divide, are petition restrictions that are cobbled together by the St. Louis Real Exchange by going door to door and collecting signatures. And these are much smaller, and in a sense, a much more sort of desperate attempt at containing the spread of African-American occupancy. And these restrictions, somewhat infamously, construe African-American occupancy of property as a nuisance. In the language of the St. Louis Exchange, a nuisance akin to having a junk shop or a rag picking establishment. Now, these in turn are widespread in the city, but they're especially widespread in suburbanizing St. Louis County. Virtually every property built between about 1918 and 1950, every new development in St. Louis County contained these restrictions. And these were, not only contained in the deeds or the subdivision dedications, but were advertised alongside the property. Just in much the same way that we'd advertise access to a good school district today, these were advertised as protected properties. Now, race restrictive deed covenants were declared unenforceable by the Supreme Court in the Shelley versus Kramer case, which came out of St. Louis in 1947. But they lived on in important ways. This is a standard private real appraisal form from St. Louis from the late 1930s. And as you can see, it identifies, as key elements of determining value, the share of the Negro population in the neighborhood, the racial influence, and the presence of deed restrictions. In turn, these restrictions and the idea that African-American occupancy was a nuisance was built into the infamous federal redlining maps, began with the Homeowners Loan Corporation and continued under the FHA. And they were an important artifact of zoning in the suburbs. That is, at the very outset, this sort of pattern of exclusionary zoning referred at its origins explicitly to the need to sustain the exclusion started by race restrictive deed covenants, but now made impossible by the Shelley versus Kramer case. And so planners in St. Louis County, in sort of crafting this pattern of exclusionary land use radiating out from the city, referred explicitly in their original zone plans to the need to sustain these covenants. And this resulted, across the metro area in a particular pattern of migration and demographic settlement. So in this series of maps, I'm showing the increase in the African-American population every 10 persons with a black dot, increase in white with a white dot, and then the corresponding decrease with red and orange. So between 1940 and 1950, what we see is part of the Great Migration from the South, particularly for the World War II era economy, and the beginnings of white flight out of the city. So the red dots and the corresponding white out in the county. Between 1950 and 1960, this pattern it becomes much more dramatic. Not only do we see continued white flight, but the orange swath in the center of St. Louis there is the clearance of the Mill Creek Valley and the destruction of thousands of African-American homes, which lead to this, this pattern of migration. This continues between 1960 and 1970, more urban renewal projects, including the first Bush Stadium, and further movement with African Americans now moving sort of ahead of the bulldozer out of downtown into the West End and then across into the inner suburbs of North County. And that continues by the time we reach the 1970s. We have as much black flight from the city as we do white flight. The population of the city of St. Louis peaks at the 1950 census at just under 900,000, and it's of course, you know, just barely scraping 300,000 today. And so we see this pattern move, you know, steadily forward with increased migration out into of African Americans out into North County in recent decades. What this means for the neighborhoods in the city left behind is a sort of dramatic pattern of decline and disinvestment. So here's an aerial shot of St. Louis, zooming in here on a Sanborn fire insurance map from 1932, which shows the density of development in that neighborhood. But as of the turn of the century, all of these houses were gone. And so we get a pattern, you know, a familiar pattern in North St. Louis of, you know, remaining houses on many blocks just sticking out like broken teeth. And one of the consequences of this was not only the impoverishment of those neighborhoods, but a lack of mobility for the people who lived in them, because patterns of housing discrimination, particularly in private realty and in federal subsidy programs in the first half of the 20th century, yielded a dramatic gap in racial wealth. So for all families, if we white median wealth, as of the latest measure, is $171,000, and black is at 89. But for families with children, the gap is even more dramatic. That is, the median wealth, the median net worth of African American families with children is zero. That means half are in debt. And this is a legacy of housing discrimination, which dramatically shapes housing opportunities going into the future, and dramatically shapes that pattern of black flight out into North St. Louis County that I mentioned earlier. So let's see what that means for the development of the county. And one of the important elements of the development of St. Louis County is that the actual residential development and then the pattern of incorporation and annexation are staggered. So the red dots here show single family homes mapped by the year in which they're built. The green footprints are municipal incorporations, and the brown footprints there are annexations or additions to those incorporations. And what's important about this story is, as you can see the county develop, a tremendous amount of residential development occurs on unincorporated land, and the incorporation or annexation comes later. So the land use decisions are really being made by private developers and then being sealed in effect by municipal incorporations and the establishment of zoning plans. And this is particularly true between 1940 and 1950, when the white flight really takes off out of the city, and the Shelley versus Kramer decision compels those suburban subdivisions to incorporate and seal their land use through exclusionary zoning. And as by the time we get into the 1970s, much of the county is actually pretty thoroughly urbanized. Large chunks of it still unincorporated. By this point, the county has its own land use plan, a planning right that it garnered in the 1960s. And then we start to see these large footprint incorporations in Western St. Louis County to essentially sort of bank land use. So not yet well developed out in areas like Westwood, but incorporated nevertheless. This pattern becomes, I think, and its impact for African Americans becomes more readily apparent if we zoom in on a couple of case studies. So let's look at Elmwood Park, which is that sort of red footprint there that's nestled between Olivet and Overland. Elmwood Park is platted in the 1890s by a developer named Elsie Meacham as a sort of affordable working class, very early generation suburb. There's Elmwood Park in blue and the contemporary boundaries of Overland and Olivet. And I'll play this forward and you'll see roughly the same pattern of residential construction preceding incorporation and annexation. So Olivet is incorporated in 1930, Overland in 1939, and then as their residential footprint grows, they start to incorporate new territories. But they do so in such a way as to completely surround Elmwood Park and leave it unincorporated. In fact, very few of the streets even, or most of the streets dead end at Elmwood Park. And importantly, much of the infrastructure that's built along with this suburban development, including water, sewer, and gas lines, also dead end at Elmwood Park. And then to add insult to injury, the zone plans for Overland and Olivet at the time quarantine Elmwood Park by zoning the land around it as industrial. So you can see these industrial and commercial buffers between the residential footprint of Elmwood Park and those of the surrounding municipalities. Same thing happens at Meacham Park in South County. And so just again, playing this story forward, Kirkwood is incorporated very early, Meacham Park there in blue. Residential development running ahead of incorporation and annexation. Then you get the addition of Crestwood and Sunset Hills by 1960. And again, Elmwood Park left as an unincorporated pocket there, and its exclusion exaggerated by patterns of zoning, in this case, commercial zones on three sides. The southern boundary of Meacham Park is, of course, cordoned off by I-44. Now, importantly, as I've already suggested, this pattern of development and of what I call sort of suburban quarantine and exclusionary zoning also has the effect of segregating the services that are provided to citizens. That in effect, you know, the drawing of both municipal and school district boundaries in St. Louis County is a form of gerrymandering, which is designed to include and exclude, to create citizens and to exclude other citizens. A good example of that are the school boundaries surrounding Kinloch, another African-American enclave dating to the 1890s in North St. Louis County. So there's Kinloch in North County, and in 1936, the school districts in that area looked like this. So the hard lines are the municipalities of Florissant, Ferguson, and at the time, the incorporated municipality of Kinloch. The shaded tan and yellow are the school district boundaries. Now, the parents in the Kinloch School District who did not live in Kinloch wanted to split off from Kinloch, not because their kids went to the same schools, because schooling was absolutely segregated at this time under Missouri law, but because they didn't want to share a tax base with the Kinloch parents. So they incorporated as the town of Berkeley and simultaneously the Berkeley School District in 1937, at the time becoming one of the wealthiest school districts in all of Missouri, and Kinloch became at the time the poorest school district in all of Missouri, because you simply sort of chopped the tax capacity of the entire district in two, clustering the poorest families, 99% of which were African American, in the new Kinloch School District. This actually lasted until 1975, when the Justice Department compelled a reorganization, what you see there in yellow, which is the current Ferguson-Florissant School District. And as is true in much of county, and especially North County, school districts overlay the municipal boundaries in this sort of crazy quilt fashion. So there are 11 municipalities that overlap with the Ferguson-Florissant School District. Only 2 of them are entirely inside the district. And as the Department of Justice noted at the time, this was, fundamentally an assault on citizenship and equal opportunity, this attempt to sort of segregate the provision of public services. Now, education is a sort of vital local public service, but this was also true of more prosaic services like the building of sewers. One consequence of the pattern of development, such as those that surrounded Elmwood Park and Meacham Park, is that these large-scale suburban developments that were common in St. Louis County in the middle of the last century were executed by what we call community builders, who provided infrastructure and essentially privatized infrastructure at the same time as they built housing. So the residents of Elmwood Park bought a 25 by 50 foot piece of land. The residents of the surrounding and newer suburbs were buying sidewalks and streetlights and potable water and sanitary sewers all at the same time. And if we look at the development of the sanitary sewer system moving westward from the city of St. Louis, we can see that it too, in effect, bypasses Meacham Park. And so, not until 1980 are there sanitary trunk lines through Meacham Park. And even at that time, it's a private responsibility to hook up to the trunk line for each homeowner. Most homeowners either cannot afford it or do not live in homes that can take conventional city water pressure. And so even at the time of its redevelopment in the 1990s, the majority of homes in Meacham Park were on septic systems. Now, these patterns of diminished citizenship are exaggerated by the county's urban renewal policies, because having encouraged this suburban pattern of development and incorporation and annexation, which essentially moves west from the city and then breaks around Meacham Park and Elmwood Park like they're sort of rocks in a stream and keeps going, the result is that St. Louis County, and particularly the St. Louis County Land Reclamation Authority, turns around in the mid-1950s and sort of says, what are these tar paper shacks and outhouses doing in the middle of our cul-de-sacs? We should do something about this. And when the Land Reclamation Authority meets for the first time in the mid-1950s, they in fact identify every pocket of African-American settlement in St. Louis County as a target for renewal. In fact, these are the only significant targets for renewal that they identify. And included, of course, are Elmwood Park and Meacham Park. The Elmwood Park plan is executed beginning in the late 1950s. And so this is the redevelopment, the project plan drafted in the early 1960s. About a third of the footprint of Elmwood Park being calved off for industrial use, and the rest being sort of redeveloped as residential. Here it is mid-redevelopment in the later 1960s. But like many urban renewal projects, Elmwood Park redevelopment proceeded in defiance of federal law because it was residential redevelopment for residential purposes, which under federal relocation statutes required that those who lived there be given first opportunity to move back. But as of the late 1960s, only one of the 125 Elmwood Park families had moved back to Elmwood Park into the new housing. Most, as you can see, bought or rented elsewhere in the county or in the city, many of them moving to areas like North Webster Groves, Kinloch, Wellston, or North City, that is deepening patterns of segregation in the city. So this was really an expulsion of a multi-generational African-American community in Elmwood Park, with the assumption, as the county LCRA conceded at the time, that those families would move back to the city. In fact, the relocation opportunity given those families in the first instance, when the LCRA went door to door in Elmwood Park, was to hand out applications to Pruitt-Ego. In fact, Elmwood Park residents eventually sued the county over this, a case that they lost in the Missouri Supreme Court on the grounds that because they no longer owned the properties that were being contested, then they didn't have standing in the case, which of course was the point of the case. But the plaintiffs nevertheless lost. A very similar sort of pattern happened in Meacham Park, similar in its origins at least, because the county identified Meacham Park, developed by the same original developer as Elmwood Park, and by this point about 80% African American, as a target for renewal. But the Meacham Park renewal plan called for relocating most of the residents of Meacham Park to Elmwood Park. And at this point, the Federal Housing and Finance Authority that was responsible for the project said no and pulled the plug, that this was not a proper use of federal funds for urban renewal. And this was also at a time when the county and its municipalities were resolutely refusing to build public housing that would accommodate those dislocated by urban renewal. So what happens is Meacham Park is surveyed in the 1950s, and the only immediate result is that the city of Kirkwood annexes just one side of Kirkwood Boulevard, essentially taking all of the tax capacity, the commercial tax capacity of Meacham Park, incorporating it into Kirkwood, and leaving the residential base of Meacham Park on its own. I-44 cuts across the southern corner of Meacham Park in the 1960s, and then it's reassessed for renewal in 1976. But this is an ongoing battle between Meacham Park residents and Kirkwood as to what redevelopment would mean. Kirkwood quite clearly wants to annex Meacham Park in order to extend policing into Meacham Park. Meacham Park residents toy with the idea of annexation because they're interested in better services, in sanitary sewers and potable water and paved streets. But this debate goes round and round until the early 1990s. Meacham Park is annexed to Kirkwood in 1991, and then under a very different mechanism, a tax increment financing scheme, we see the development of what becomes Kirkwood Commons, the commercial shopping mall development that takes up about a third of the former footprint of Meacham Park, extending further than Meacham Park residents were promised. Now, some of the tax increment financing dollars are rolled back into the residential footprint of Meacham Park, but it's a pattern of quarantine and exclusion and development that leaves very bitter feelings. And those bitter feelings, of course, bubble to the surface in the Kirkwood shootings in 2008, when Cookie Thornton, an African-American contractor from Meacham Park, who fought for the annexation and the redevelopment on the hope that he would get some of the business, when that didn't transpire, not only was Thornton not a beneficiary of the redevelopment, but he became a victim of the annexation, because once Kirkwood's municipal code applied to Meacham Park after 1991, Thornton ran up hundreds of thousands of dollars in fines for parking his truck on the street, for stacking drywall in his driveway, for doing things that he used to be able to do on unincorporated land, but now couldn't do inside the city of Kirkwood. And that, I think, the Kirkwood shootings and the sort of predatory impact of code enforcement in Kirkwood and Meacham Park give us our segue to what happens in Ferguson a few years later. There is this pattern, evidence, as early as the United States Commission on Civil Rights hearings that were held in St. Louis County in 1970, that African Americans were targeted differently by municipal services. That is, ignored or neglected in some respects by things like schooling and the provision of sewers or potable water, but given intense attention by the police. Captured in this quote from Adele Adams from 1970. I don't know if they were protecting me more or protecting someone from me. And in fact, we get this stark pattern of segregation in the greater St. Louis region, which essentially extends the Del Mar Divide out into the county as North St. Louis spills over into North County. And so what used to be a sort of hard boundary between city and county hard racial boundary phrase. But as you can see, the pattern of segregation in the city is still or in the metro area is still very stark. And African Americans moving out of North St. Louis and into North County, of course, are constrained by all the resource disadvantages that I outlined earlier, by the fact that they hadn't had the opportunity to accrue wealth because they were redlined out of housing markets, or by the fact that as homeowners in North St. Louis, they saw their home values plummet with disinvestment rather than build equity for the next generation. And so this yields a migration into what urban historians often call secondhand suburbs. That is, suburbs like Ferguson, which were originally developments serving white flight out of the city, and eventually the white flight moved further west in the county, and the African American population filtered in to what remained of the only really affordable housing in St. Louis County. As we can see, if we look at North County, looking here at year built and at lot size, that the footprint in and around Ferguson is the houses are built much earlier, and they're generally much smaller than the suburban development that extends out into central and west St. Louis County. But these lots are often of 5,000 or 10,000 square feet, quite small by conventional suburban standings. And what this meant was that just as African Americans were migrating or filtering in to this more affordable housing stock, those municipalities were starting to descend into a sort of ongoing fiscal crisis. This is in large part driven by the fact that exclusive single-family zoning, particularly on smaller lots, as in Ferguson and other municipalities, made sense in the 1950s and 1960s, made fiscal sense. But in Missouri and elsewhere, there is a sort of campaign to put a cap on property taxes that culminates in Missouri's Hancock Amendment in 1980. And so the property tax becomes less and less stable as a source of revenue for these municipalities, particularly if property values aren't growing. And they rely increasingly on sales taxes. So as we can see, revenues from residential property taxes are high in municipalities like Clayton and Ladue, but Ferguson, has a lower trajectory than even the city of St. Louis. Its property values are falling. In the midst of the Great Recession, fully a quarter of sales or transfers in the city of Ferguson are foreclosures. And so residential property taxes are, because of the limits put on them by the state and because of this pattern of decline in values, not a reliable source of revenue. And so cities like Ferguson turn to commercial property taxes. But of course, the way to build a commercial property tax base in the long run is to give it away in the short run. And so Ferguson has its share of tax increment financing districts and enterprise zones intended to retain or attract business. But these either promise commercial tax revenues only in the future, or they, as in a TIF zone, they dedicate those revenues just to the footprint of the zone and not to the general revenues of the city. So you could, as many county municipalities do, look to rely on sales taxes. But of course, the sales tax base is migrating west in the county, and Missouri tax law sort of sets up this insane competition among municipalities as to whether they'll be a point of origin city and keep their sales taxes, or whether they'll be a pool city and join all of the other struggling municipalities in a state or a county-wide pool. But as the sales tax base migrates west, the city of Ferguson, you can see in their combined annual financial reports, are constantly debating, whether to attract new retail, whether to be a pool city or a point of origin city. But in fact, their sales taxes and sales tax revenues are plummeting. So unable to rely on property and sales taxes, what do struggling fiscal settings like this do? Well, in part, they raise their property taxes very nearly to the top of what the state allows. So in this map, I show local school revenues as the shading So this is the revenue for the school district. And as you can see, in North County, those levies are very near the high of the highest rate allowed by the state, whereas the wealthy central county districts are able to raise 3 times as much money purely on local revenues and rely very little on state backfill aid. So it's more expensive in a sense for residents of these fiscally strapped cities. And then with all of these revenue sources drying up, Ferguson, among other St. Louis County municipalities, particularly in North County, rely increasingly on court fines and revenues as a way of keeping the lights on at City Hall. On the eve of Michael Brown's death, these had risen to over 20% of the revenues of the city of Ferguson. And that, in many respects, is what leads to the confrontation on Canfield Drive in August of 2014. Both the fact that Darren Wilson, along with his fellow officers, had been instructed to go out, stop anyone you can, and when you do stop them, pile on as many charges as you can, because that's our revenue stream. And these, as the Department of Justice report made clear, these instructions were explicit. Important to recognize, that it's this sort of punitive and predatory form of sort of revenue extraction was at play here, because Brown and his friend Darren Wilson were stopped under an obscure Ferguson municipal ordinance that is no longer on the books, called Manner of Walking in the Roadway, which is simply a sort of trumped up jaywalking charge. And then the second point I would make here, which I think is important, is that in the racially transitional neighborhood like Ferguson, the police were, in a sense, enforcing or trying to enforce those patterns of segregation that were so meticulously laid down over the last 100 or 75 years, that all of these little municipal footprints and gerrymandered school districts in St. Louis County were created to play their part in this local pattern of segregation. And even as those boundaries in terms of racial boundaries begin to fray, and you see these transitional neighborhoods like those in North County, you nevertheless have this disjuncture between the idea that African Americans are out of place or a threat, and the very uneven targeting, as the Department of Justice documented pretty thoroughly, in which African Americans, even in neighborhoods in which they live, are seen less as constituents to be protected, less as citizens than as potential offenders and sources of revenue. And that's it. So there's some links here there is an online companion to Citizen Brown in which some of the maps that I've shown, they're animated or interactive versions of them, and the raw data and map files for Greater St. Louis are on the Mapping Decline site, which is just listed below that. And be happy to take questions.
All right, thank you very much, Colin, for that detailed overview of Citizen Brown. And if anyone, let there be light, if anyone has questions, either you could throw them in the chat or you can unmute yourself and ask the question to Mr. Gordon. And I guess I'll start off with a question. So on one of your chapters, you mentioned there's not only a lot of times we look at the financial impacts of property and what their highest and best use in producing, but it really doesn't get to the social side. So for example, like Mill Creek Valley, there were a number of entrepreneurs, African-American entrepreneurs that lived there, and they were then uprooted. So, you plant the seed, you want something to grow, but then it's mowed over later. And what was kind of if you can go into more, Colin, about the social impacts of uprooting communities and how those, how does that impact future generations?
Yeah, it's a good point because I mean, Elmwood Park is a good example because this was a community of African American families uh, whose settlement predated any of the sort of conventional white flight suburbanization that would eventually surround them, but whose occupancy of that property was nevertheless construed as a nuisance. And when they were relocated under urban renewal, the loss in home equity, um, sense of community was absolutely dramatic. This came at a time, of course, in the mid 1960s, when much of the rest of the property of the available property in St. Louis County was pretty effectively segregated by the real estate industry, in which it was still common practice in 1964 to list properties four colored separately in the classified ads. And so not only are the African American occupants of Elmwood Park dispossessed of their homes on the pretense that a public purpose is being served, but their home purchase or home rentals outside of Elmwood Park, they end up spending much more to get much less. And so, one of the sort of fundamental ironies here is that, there is a familiar story by which African Americans are excluded from the housing market and robbed of intergenerational wealth from that way. But it's equally true that African Americans who are in the housing market are not rewarded in the same way for that, because they're dispossessed, as in settings like Elmwood Park, or they're stuck in neighborhoods of declining value, as in North St. Louis.
I have a question. In your research, this is Elliot Leibson with Ferguson. Did you look at annexation rules as well and their impact? And the reason I'm asking, right now in the county, actually this is a statewide rule, you cannot annex an area and take over their fire district, and it's very convoluted. But what it does ostensibly is it locks municipal boundaries in place. And I'm wondering, did you look at that, and is there a racial piece on that? Because ostensibly it was passed to protect the fire districts, but in listening to your presentation today, I'm wondering if there was that other piece as well.
Yeah, you faded out a bit at the end there, but I think I got the gist of it. A little bit in Citizen Brown, but more so in Mapping Decline. I do talk quite a bit about the sort of rules, the statewide rules on annexation and incorporation. And I think a couple of things are important. One is that until really the 1980s, the rules in Missouri were remarkably lax for either initial incorporation or annexation. That there are virtually no sort of standards until the Sawyer Act is passed in the early 1960s. And that enables this sort of fragmented municipal footprint to sort of play this segregationist role, because it becomes very easy to create very small, even sort of small enough to be dysfunctional as service providing units, municipalities, which are primarily concerned with controlling land use and not providing services. And so the laugher in this example is always Champ, Missouri, which is, 6 houses, 13 residents, 6 garbage cans, and doesn't really provide any services. It just contracts out to the county or neighboring municipalities. So, but I think you're exactly right. One of the unfortunate ironies of the tightening of state standards, particularly on annexation, is it tend to lock that fragmentation in place. So that any attempts to undo the fragmentation, most famously or infamously in recent memory with the Better Together effort, are sort of very large scale and complicated efforts that, to date have not really gone anywhere.
I'm going to do two things real quick. I'm going to throw up a on the screen some clips from your book, Colin, kind of that stood out when reading.
You need
But
me to stop sharing?
yes, please. Let's see.
Okay.
I'm going to throw some up there for people to see, but also I'm going to read a comment from, whoops, we have a comment in the chat. My comment over here. The comment is, there has been talk of city-county consolidation in St. Louis. Would such consolidation help address economic disparity and level provision of services in the region?
Yeah, I think potentially. I mean, it's important to recognize that, you know, the Better Together effort has a long history. That sort of once a generation, there's been a discussion of you know, should we stitch these two back together again? They're separated in 1876, and each time it comes around, there are slightly different sort of coalition of interests and opponents and potential winners and potential losers. But it's really about overcoming the sort of fragmentation that feeds sort of spatial and economic and racial inequality in the region. One of the most interesting sort of musings on this that I saw in the archival record of the Board of Freeholders' consideration of consolidation in the 1980s was somebody who's sitting at a meeting with, and they all had maps of St. Louis in front of them with these new sort of fanciful municipalities drawn, most of which transversed the city-county line. And what this planner did was drew a series, you know, he sort of divided the metro region up the way the South Pole is divided up. So everybody gets a sort of pinpoint at the riverfront, and then it divides out like a slice of pie going out into the county, so that everyone has, you know, a little bit of riverfront industry, a little bit of downtown, a little bit of West City, a little bit of inner county, and a little bit of outer county to manage. And that gives you, you know, a fiscal base and a school and an equitable school district and all that sort of thing. So, you know, but, you know, erasing the lines that are there and drawing new ones is an enormous, you know, enterprise, not only as a sort of, you know, we fight tooth and nail over the redrawing of school catchment boundaries in a single school district in ways that are, you know, often impossible to reach an equitable solution. And doing this across a metro area is extremely difficult. You know, the flip side, I think, the other way to approach this is to say, well, we'll leave the boundaries in place, but we'll just make them less consequential by regionalizing more services and decision making. So, you know, there's some obvious areas where regional efficiencies overcome, you know, the impulse for home rule, like sewers. Doesn't make sense to stop and start sewer treatment at every municipal boundary. Another example is transportation, right? You can't really go after federal transportation money unless you do some regional planning. It's not a leap to, and indeed other settings have pursued this, to think about doing this for economic development as well, to have a region-wide TIF board that assesses whether, you know, a tax increment financing zone in, you know, Crestwood or somewhere like that is just pirating investment from another municipality. Or you could do the same sort of regional determination of zoning, take that power away from the municipalities, and the fragmentation would not have the same gravity on equity grounds that it does now.
Another question, so there was a recent article by a former, it was a economist that noted with racial inequalities in the United States that we're missing out on roughly, and I don't remember the timeline, but $16 trillion thanks to the inequities just based on race. And I'm going to expand that to inequities between women and men as well. If we got past this hump and hurdle of racial inequalities and gender inequalities, what would our cities kind of look like at this point? I mean, economically, how we see from your book how the impact and on today's standards between in your chapter with like Ferguson, for example, with how the impacts of the 1960s and 1920s, you know, going back further. But if we bridge those gaps, what would society look like today? You know, how would things be a little bit different in your opinion?
Wow, I mean, it's a difficult question. It reminds me of, you know, the Ray Bradbury short story where someone goes back in time and accidentally steps on a butterfly and changes the entire future. Um, I mean, you know, one way to approach it is to think that, you know, much of this is not the working of an unfettered market that has yielded this. That you know, our public policy choices have distorted that market in fundamental ways, in big scale urban renewal projects, and in the incentives and disincentives that we create with zoning and school district boundaries and that sort of thing. So, but it's very difficult to think of how to undo that, because we don't have the same tools at our disposal. We don't have, you know, there is basically no federal urban renewal policy, and hasn't been for a generation. There's nothing anywhere near like the availability of federal resources that were available in the urban renewal period. And, you know, undoing the damage is you know, just as pretentious a task and just as expensive a task as doing it in the first place. So we're sort of left with sort of smaller scale solutions, I think, you know, and which is things like, you know, revenue sharing and regional decision making and that sort of thing. But, you know, I find it hard to, you know, offer a clean answer to the question, because you'd have to run, you know, there's a lot in that film to run backwards, you know, including, you know, the civil rights movement and you know, various revolutions in energy and transportation. There's just, I mean, there's so many moving pieces that I think I'm just going to evade the question.
No, that's fine. And we have, I'm going to read out another question. Was there something in particular about 20th century state level legislation in Missouri that enabled or encouraged a fragmented municipal incorporation we see in St. Louis County that we don't see in many peer Midwestern cities? Or do you think it was a unique social, cultural bug in the mid 20th century in St. Louis area?
So, yeah, it's a good question. So the first thing I think to recognize is that there is a general pattern for Midwestern cities of relatively lax land use standards well into the second third of the 20th century. Missouri was a little bit at the front of that curve, but because most Midwestern cities, you know, Milwaukee, Des Moines, Chicago, you know, on at least one of their boundaries had little constraints on growth. Like there were no other municipalities that they were going to run up against. Didn't really have very strict rules on sprawl by municipal fragmentation, by suburbanization. Now, having said that, it's also true that St. Louis, even within that cohort, stands out a little bit. First of all, I think the Missouri rules on incorporation and annexation were laxer for longer than they were in Illinois or Iowa or in some other, or certainly in Minnesota, other Midwestern settings. The second point I would make is that St. Louis is both a Midwestern city and a border city. And so its race relations are a little bit starker than you find in Chicago or Minneapolis or other northern cities. Its African-American population is well established by the turn of the century. So when the Great Migration takes off in the wake of World War I, St. Louis is much more aggressive in pursuing a sort of architecture of segregation than our other cities. And so much more elaborate use of race restrictive deed covenants, of institutions like zoning and that sort of thing. Because part of the consequence of being a border city is you have a more well-established African-American population. So the threat is already there, that nuisance is already there. But secondly, that you have a city in which the land use policies are sort of northern in their patterns of segregation, but race relations are essentially southern in, you know, in sort of day-to-day interactions, which is a pretty dangerous combination. And then the one other, you know, piece of this that I think sets St. Louis apart is, you know, unlike Chicago, unlike Detroit, at least until, you know, the last generation, St. Louis is not a growing metropolis after World War I. You know, it's a river-based economy. And like a lot of river-based economies, you know, its best days were behind it by the time it got to the early years of the 20th century. And most, you know, planners like Harlem Bartholomew noted this all the time, that we're losing the race with other cities. So, and that sort of attenuates the problems of sort of white flight and sprawl. It raises the stakes a little bit. You know, you get this intense deindustrialization through the urban core. You know, this is a city who or a metro area that between 1950 and 2000, I think its population grows about 2.5 times, but its land area grows 12 times. It just sort of flattens out. And, you know, and at the same time, the central city is emptying out. So, you know, the rules are laxer on incorporation and annexation. It's sort of a, you know, a border city, which makes it a little bit different from Chicago and Detroit, and its economic struggles are much more protracted.
Time for a few more questions, and I'll add one in. So as you noted, we have about 87 or so municipalities in the St. Louis County. We have surrounding regions that can easily access, you know, Jefferson County, 3 in Illinois, St. Charles County. Is there, and there are many planners in the St. Louis, planners who represent these areas on this call, learning from you as well. Is there, if we can kind of get past the racial component, which we're optimistically trying to do, what is there an advantage to having a number of municipalities? Usually there are other books like Cities Without Suburbs that talk about areas that have one sprawling school district versus all these little ones with the same footprint. Are there, if we could turn this around, are there advantages to having this fragmentation to maybe local control that is somehow an advantage? If the answer is no, that's fine too.
Well, there are advantages. I mean, you know, there are substantial advantages, you know, which observers, you know, going back to de Tocqueville have noted about small units of government that have to do with, you know, local relationships and civic engagement and that sort of thing. But I think for, you know, for some of the reasons that I talk about in terms of the way in which jurisdictions are created, I mean, they're not created with the goal of building and sustaining civic engagement. You know, in fact, you know, voting rates in local elections are even more abysmal than they are for national elections. There's not much evidence that we gained on that score with regard to, you know, local home rule. And it's, you know, it's also true that given the distribution of responsibilities across those jurisdictions, they're often pitted against each other in ways that are destructive to the collective good. You know, so everyone's trying to give you know, a tax deal to the next Target or Sam's Club, when in fact, you know, you're not getting more Targets or more Sam's Clubs in St. Louis County than you would on purely market grounds. They're just not paying, you know, into the general property tax revenue as a result of this competition. And so, you know, you set up municipalities to sort of play this game of pirating from each other, which I think, you know, overall is, you know, is not only sort of destructive to the collective good, but it's you know, it fails on both equity and efficiency grounds. You know, there's not much evidence that it's delivering really for anyone.
Another question, you bring up in your book, you bring up, in Ferguson specifically, the tiffing and the actual, you know, what it's meant for and promised to do and what the actual impacts are with in terms of taxing money received. A lot of proponents always of TIF reform always talk about, you know, looking at it as we need to get back to the original intent, which is real blighted properties. But on another side of that is that, you know, taking away something that people already use is kind of difficult and kind of gets you nowhere, which we've seen with TIF reform. But would you rather, what's your thought about, let's say, a new program outside of TIF that really does get back to so if you have these stagnant properties sitting there that are, when I say locally owned, I mean truly, you know, a neighborhood resident owns this place. They don't make nearly as much as, you know, some of the developers, so, and they don't have the access to capital. Would a program, instead of replacing TIF or TIF reform, would just a new whole program to address that actually work in favor of what communities nowadays need to do? Because I know a lot of the, again, West Florissant corridor and Ferguson, for example, a lot of those properties are, you know, 40 years old, 50 years old, 60 years old, and we don't always, in order to get like a new big multi-million-dollar development, that takes a lot, and of course we're going to TIF it. So instead, in the meantime, could we just use other financing tools that literally, you know, instead of spending out $5 million on a TIF over 23 years, you spend $50,000 and get, you know, a functionable property in that case?
Yeah, I mean, I think you put your finger on this sort of essential problem that, you know, once you give people a tool, it's hard to take it away. And you, again, it's a matter of the sort of setting up municipalities to fail or to undermine the collective good, because no one's in a position to sort of unilaterally disarm and say, we're not going to do this anymore. You know, and you'll see a lot of economic development folks who say, you know, whose strongest argument is we do this because everybody else is doing it and we'd be crazy not to. But of course, if everybody stopped doing it, everybody would be better off. So, I mean, I think the problem is not the incentive. The problem is really twofold, I think. One is what is the public purpose that is being served, and how do you define the public? So it's important to recognize that, you know, the power of eminent domain exercised in redevelopment was originally granted for explicit public purposes, like you know, you're building a canal, you're building a railroad, you're building something the public will use, and you need to take private property to do it. That slid over the course of the 20th century, that idea of public purpose, next to the idea of blight, where public purpose was served by removing threats to the public welfare, dilapidated substandard properties, that sort of thing, and then slid even further in a way that blight lost all meaning, in the sense that if you could say that a property simply would generate more tax revenue, that was a sufficient public purpose. You know, so there's the famous, you know, West County case where a mall developer on a mall that was originally developed under a tax increment financing scheme wanted another TIF, and on the state form where it said describe blight, wrote the mall does not have a Nordstrom's, and was taken to court for it, and he won because the trial judge said, you know, blight is in the eye of the beholder. And so, first of all, we don't have any standards as to what constitutes a public purpose in entering into an economic development deal. And, you know, TIF deals lack any of the criteria that typically go alongside things like empowerment and enterprise zones, which pay much closer attention to existing rates of poverty, existing rates of unemployment, you know, tangible measures of blight, or to other more targeted forms of economic development, which often, you know, require a cost benefit analysis, which says, you know, the new jobs are going to cost this much in tax revenue and yield this much in tax revenue. I mean, personally, you know, based on my reading of the research literature, I think that it's never a net benefit to TIF for retail, because the life of the revenue producing property is relatively short. I mean, how many 23-year-old malls still look good? And the job base is abysmal. And so it's hard to make a case that a public purpose is being served in any, I think, retail development.
Okay. All right. Well, if we want to give Mr. Colin Gordon a round of applause, thank you for, joining us. The comments have nothing but awesome things to say about you, Colin. So really, thank you for joining us, and also writing I saw a newspaper article in the local paper about why a person out of town, you always get this argument, a person out of town is writing about St. Louis. And I thought it was ironic because I'm like, well, and I actually invited the author of the paper to it, because I'm like, well, next week we're having the guy. So,
yeah.
But no, this was a wonderful presentation, and I just thank you for joining us today all the way from Iowa. So,
Yep. It was a pleasure.
You know, and next up, just a few other announcements. If I could find my cursor here, my share screen here. There we are. So again, we have copies of Citizen Brown, and it is signed by Colin Gordon himself. So if you're interested, please shoot me an email, and we'll get you, if copies remain, a copy of Citizen Brown. This is for free, by the way. Also, just a reminder, it's Community Planning Month, as even Jackie mentioned earlier in her presentation with CBB. So celebrate planning, celebrate yourselves and the work that you guys do, and celebrate your boards, your council, and your community as well. November's luncheon, we'll have Vivian Gibson, as Colin mentioned. He noted Mill Creek Valley and Citizen Brown, so she'll join us, and we will also have books to signed books to give away by Vivian, who is a local resident here in St. Louis. We have the Chancellor Certificate in Planning and Zoning put on by UMSL, East West Gateway, and APA going on now. So look for your local e-blast, e-blast for that. We thank our October sponsors, Alta and CDB Planning, as well as our other general sponsors of this section. And we recently, last week, we had the Missouri State Planning Conference, where we had a number of people who did virtual on-demand sessions. So some of the people who are here today, like Gary Newcomer, Bob Lewis, Stephen Eifendahl, have wonderful presentations that you can watch if you register for that conference. And I don't think it's too late to get the on-demand sessions that are also worth CM credits. At the conference, we also honored our Missouri Great Places 2020, which unfortunately, St. Louis, we're going to get on, we'll be on next year for the Great Places 2021, because we have wonderful places to be and explore for people. This year's recipients were downtown Drake Harbor, and also the River Market in Kansas City. A few announcements. We have the, for the Illinois side of St. Louis, we have the APA Citizens Planners Workshop on October 29th from 6 to 9. That would be virtual. You can contact me for more information, and also Scott Hansen is the coordinator on that, our former St. Louis Metro Section president. East West Gateway has the annual, their annual meeting, which they also provide the Outstanding Local Government Achievement Awards. That's going to be November 19th from 1 to 3. And finally, I would like to say really thank you for joining us. If you're looking for a copy of the book, please email me. And this presentation is being recorded, and it will be available soon on our section website. But with that, thank you for joining us, and just celebrate Community Planning Month and be proud of yourselves. And with that, I'll end the meeting. So I'll see you next month. Thank you.